The water was supposed to be their grave, but it became their weapon. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, August 15, 1741. 3 sisters stood at the edge of the wharf, chains heavy on their wrists, watching as the slave ship prepared for another journey north. What the masters didn't know was that these women had been planning for months. What they couldn't predict was how 3 enslaved sisters would turn the very element meant to drown them into the instrument of their vengeance. By dawn, 7 white men would be floating face down in that same harbor, and the Ashford sisters would become legends whispered about in quarters from Virginia to Georgia. This is the story of Kesey, Amara, and Zuri, 3 women who refused to be cargo, 3 sisters who turned drowning into justice, 3 souls who proved that even in chains, the current of rebellion runs deeper than any ocean. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like these deserve to be remembered. The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ships rocked gently in the current, their masts swaying like the arms of hanged men. The air was thick with salt, tar, and something else. Something that made even the seagulls circle higher than usual. It was the scent of fear, though no white man would admit it. The year was 1741, and the colony was still shaking from the Stono Rebellion 2 years prior. Whispers travelled faster than horses through the low country. Stories of slaves who fought back, who burned plantations, who chose death over chains. The authorities had crushed that uprising with brutal efficiency, but the memory lingered like smoke in a closed room. At the centre of Charleston's slave market stood the Ashford sisters. Not by choice, but by circumstance that had carved their names into the ledgers of human misery. Kesey, the eldest at 25, carried herself with the bearing of royalty, which she had been before the ships came. Her homeland had called her a river priestess, a woman who spoke to water spirits and commanded the tides. But here, she was just another piece of property, valued at £300 sterling. Amara, 22, had been a warrior before the slavers' nets found her village. Her scars told stories of battles fought and won, of enemies who underestimated the fury that lived behind her steady gaze. In the auction blocks, they called her difficult, which only increased her price, and Zuri, 19, possessed something the white men couldn't name but desperately wanted to own. She had the gift of sight, the ability to read currents both in water and in men's souls. Her eyes held depths that made grown men look away, and her silence carried the weight of prophecy. They had been sold together, a package deal to Captain Marcus Whitmore, a man whose wealth came from the triangle trade that turned human souls into sugar and rum. His plantation, Riverside Manor, sat like a cancer on the banks of the Ashley River, where the screams of the broken echoed across the water each night. For 2 years, the sisters had endured. They had watched children torn from mothers' arms. They had seen men worked to death in rice fields that turned red with more than clay. They had served at tables where their owners discussed their bodies like livestock and their futures like weather. But the sisters had also been watching, learning, planning. Kesey understood that water was more than an element. It was memory, carrying the tears of ancestors and the blood of the murdered. Amara knew that every chain had a weak link. Every master had a moment of vulnerability. And Zuri could see what was coming, the way the currents would shift, the way justice would flow like a tide that couldn't be stopped. The plan had taken months to form, whispered between them in the pre-dawn darkness when only the marsh birds were listening. It began with observation. They studied the routines of their captors, memorized the schedules of ships, learned which guards drank too much and which ones fell asleep at their posts. They discovered that Captain Whitmore had debts, serious ones, and that he planned to sell them north to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the life expectancy was measured in seasons, not years. The sale was scheduled for mid-August, when the harbour would be crowded with ships, and the chaos of commerce would mask any disturbance. What their captors didn't understand was that the sisters had never stopped being what they were before the chains. Casey still spoke to water spirits in the language of her ancestors. Amara's warrior instincts had only sharpened under oppression, and Zuri's gift of sight had grown stronger in the darkness of slavery, fed by suffering and honed by necessity. They weren't just three women. They were a force of nature disguised as property, a storm gathering strength in the eye of complacency. The morning of August 15th broke grey and humid, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to sweat. The harbour was alive with activity as merchants prepared for the day's business. Sailors hauled cargo, dock workers loaded ships, and buyers examined human merchandise like they were inspecting horses. The Ashford sisters stood on the auction block, hands bound, eyes downcast in the performance of submission they had perfected over months of planning. But beneath the surface, currents were shifting. Captain Whitmore strutted through the crowd like a peacock, his coat buttons gleaming in the weak sunlight. He had already negotiated the sale to a Louisiana planter named Bertrand Calhoun, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him like the stench of rotting fish. 7 other men had gathered to witness the transaction, each one complicit in the machinery of human bondage. They laughed and joked as if they were trading cattle, their voices carrying across the water like the cries of carrion birds. But the sisters were listening to different voices, the whisper of wind across water, the pulse of tides against wooden hulls, the ancient rhythm that connected them to powers older than any human law. Kesey felt the pull of the harbour, the way the currents wanted to flow. Amara sensed the weakness in their captor's confidence, the moment when their guard would drop, and Zuri saw the threads of fate converging, the precise instant when everything would change. The auction began with the usual degradations. Men in fine clothes examined the sisters like livestock, commenting on their teeth, their muscle tone, their potential for breeding. The bidding was swift and brutal, a numbers game that reduced human souls to currency. When the gavel fell, sealing their fate to the Louisiana plantation, the sisters showed no emotion. They had expected this. They had planned for this. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and whispered about in slave quarters for decades to come. As Captain Whitmore approached to finalize the transaction, Casey began to hum. It was barely audible at first, a sound that seemed to come from the water itself. The tune was older than memory, a song her grandmother had taught her by moonlight near sacred rivers. Amara joined in, her voice adding harmonies that made the hair on men's arms stand up. And Zuri, still silent, began to sway with a rhythm that seemed to pull the very air around them into motion. The white men noticed but dismissed it as the strange customs of African heathens. They had no idea they were listening to their own funeral dirge. The song was a calling, a summoning of powers that had been sleeping beneath the harbour's surface, waiting for the right voices to wake them. As the sisters sang, the water began to respond, imperceptibly at first, then with growing urgency, the tides began to shift against their natural rhythm. The harbour, which should have been calm at that hour, started to churn with an energy that made experienced sailors uneasy. But the transaction continued. Money changed hands. Papers were signed. The sisters were led toward the ship that would carry them to Louisiana and certain death. Their chains clinked with each step, a metallic percussion that accompanied their ancient song. The dock workers who heard it later said it sounded like the ocean itself was weeping. The white men who dismissed it would never live to understand their mistake. As they reached the edge of the wharf, where the ship's gangplank stretched across dark water like a bridge to hell, the sisters' song reached its crescendo. The harmony they created wasn't just music. It was invocation, calling on ancestors who had died in these same waters, summoning the spirits of the drowned to bear witness to this moment of reckoning. The harbour responded with a violence that defied nature, waves rising where there should have been calm, currents reversing their ancient flow. Captain Whitmore, still counting his money, was the first to notice something was wrong. The ship beside them lurched violently, though there was no wind to explain it. Other vessels in the harbour began to rock with increasing violence, their anchor chains straining against forces that seemed to come from the depths themselves. The water around the wharf started to boil with an energy that made the bravest sailors step back from the edge. That's when Casey stopped humming and looked directly into Captain Whitmore's eyes. For the first time since her capture, she smiled. It was not the expression of a broken slave, but the face of a river priestess who remembered her power. "The water you sold us to," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent harbour, "has been waiting to meet you." The moment those words left Casey's lips, the harbour exploded into chaos. The water beneath the wharf didn't just rise. It erupted with the fury of centuries, sending spray and foam cascading across the wooden planks, like the tears of every soul who had drowned in these waters. The ship that was meant to carry them to Louisiana tilted violently to starboard, its hull scraping against the dock with a sound like screaming wood. Captain Whitmore stumbled backward, his face draining of colour as he watched the impossible unfold before him. The money in his hands scattered like autumn leaves, bills floating on water that defied every law of nature he understood. Behind him, the 7 witnesses to their sale stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what their eyes were seeing. The harbour had become a living thing, angry and ancient, responding to voices that spoke in tongues older than their civilization. Amara felt the chains on her wrists grow loose, not from any key, but from the metal itself seeming to soften under the pressure of forces beyond human comprehension. She looked at her sisters, seeing in their faces the same recognition. This was the moment they had been preparing for, not just through months of planning, but through lifetimes of remembering who they truly were beneath the lies of bondage. Zuri's gift of sight exploded into crystal clarity. She could see the threads of fate weaving themselves into new patterns, the way the water would flow, the precise moments when each of their captors would meet the justice they had earned through years of cruelty. She saw Captain Whitmore's terror, genuine and raw, as he realized that the women he had treated as cargo possessed powers that made his wealth meaningless and his authority as fragile as morning mist. The first man to fall was Thomas Ashby, the ship's quartermaster who had taken particular pleasure in the sisters' suffering during their time at Riverside Manor. He had whipped Zuri for looking at him directly, had forced Amara to scrub blood from his boots after particularly brutal punishments, had told Casey that her African gods had abandoned her to Christian masters. Now he stood at the edge of the wharf, mesmerized by the churning water, when a wave larger than any natural tide should have produced reached up like a hand and pulled him in. He didn't scream. The water filled his lungs too quickly for that, but his eyes, wide with the knowledge of his own mortality, met Zuri's for one final moment before he disappeared beneath the surface. She watched without emotion, seeing in his drowning not cruelty but balance. The same water that had swallowed slave ships was claiming him now, and the symmetry was as perfect as it was terrible. Dr. Samuel Hartwell was next. He had been the plantation's physician, a man who treated human property with less care than he showed his horses. He had refused to tend Amara's infected wounds after a beating, claiming that slaves healed differently than real people. He had watched Casey suffer through fever without offering medicine, saying that Africans were naturally resistant to disease. Now he backed away from the water's edge, his medical bag clutched to his chest like armor that wouldn't protect him from the judgment rising from the depths. The wave that took him was smaller, almost gentle, but no less final. It wrapped around his ankles like liquid chains and dragged him into water that had suddenly become deeper than the harbour's natural depth. His bag floated for a moment, instruments of healing scattered like toys, before sinking into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. Judge Cornelius Blackwood had presided over the legal proceedings that had cemented the sisters' bondage, ruling that their petition for freedom based on their capture from neutral territory was without merit. He had declared from his bench that Africans possessed no rights that white men were bound to respect, his gavel falling like thunder on dreams of justice. Now that same thunder answered from the water as waves crashed against the wharf with increasing violence. He tried to run, his judicial robes flapping behind him like broken wings, but the wooden planks beneath his feet had become slick with spray that seemed to follow him wherever he fled. When he slipped, it was almost graceful, a tumbling fall that ended in water that closed over his head with finality. His wig floated briefly on the surface, a ridiculous monument to authority that meant nothing in the face of forces older than human law. The remaining men pressed together in a tight group, their earlier confidence evaporating like steam in the face of what they couldn't explain or control. Captain Whitmore tried to maintain his composure, shouting orders to sailors who were too terrified to obey, demanding that someone explain what sorcery was at work, act with each but his voice, car word, betraying the fear that gnawed at his certainty like rot in ship's timber. Reverend Josiah Mills, who had preached that slavery was God's will and that Africans were cursed to servitude, began muttering prayers in Latin, as if ancient words could protect him from powers more ancient still. His Bible, leather-bound and gold-leafed, trembled in his hands as he read passages about divine judgment, never understanding that he was living through the very thing he claimed to worship. When the water took him, it was while he was mid-prayer, the holy book floating beside him like a raft that couldn't bear his weight. Plantation overseer Marcus Dunham had been the instrument of daily terror at Riverside Manor, the man who had wielded whips and brands and worse, with the enthusiasm of someone who found joy in others' pain. He had scarred all three sisters in different ways, leaving marks on their bodies and souls that would never fully heal. Now he stood paralyzed by terror, watching his associates disappear into water that had become hungry for the taste of their cruelty. When his turn came, the water didn't rush to claim him. Instead, it rose slowly around his feet, giving him time to understand what was happening, to feel the same helplessness he had inflicted on countless others. He begged, his voice high and desperate, promising freedom, promising gold, promising anything if they would just make it stop. But the sisters watched in silence as the harbour swallowed his pleas along with his body, leaving only ripples to mark where he had stood. Merchant banker Harrison Cole had financed the purchase of hundreds of enslaved people, turning human misery into profitable investments with the cold calculation of a man who saw suffering only as numbers in ledgers. He had evaluated the sisters like livestock, discussing their potential productivity with the detached interest of someone calculating return on investment. The water that claimed him moved with the same cold efficiency he had shown in his business dealings, swift and without mercy. The last to fall was attorney Benjamin Crenshaw, who had written the contracts that bound the sisters to their fate, crafting legal language that transformed human beings into property with the stroke of a pen. He had argued in court that Africans were naturally suited to bondage, that their capture and enslavement was not only legal, but morally justified. As the water rose around him, he tried to negotiate, offering legal arguments against his own drowning, as if the harbour could be convinced by precedent and procedure. But water recognizes no human law, and the ancestors who guided its flow had their own sense of justice. He went under still talking, still trying to lawyer his way out of a reckoning that had been decades in the making. His briefcase floated for a moment, legal documents scattering on the surface like leaves, before sinking into depths that would keep their secrets forever. Throughout it all, the sisters stood unmoved by the chaos surrounding them. Their chains had fallen away completely now. not broken but dissolved, as if the metal itself recognized that it had no power over women who commanded forces older than civilization. They watched each drowning with the calm attention of judges presiding over a court, where justice finally flowed like water finding its natural level. The harbour began to calm as the last body disappeared beneath the surface. The waves that had defied nature settled back into their normal rhythm, and the ships that had rocked violently now floated peacefully in water that looked as innocent as morning dew. But the scent of salt and terror lingered in the air, and every sailor in Charleston Harbour knew that something fundamental had changed in the balance between oppressor and oppressed. Kessie, Amara and Zuri stood at the edge of the wharf where moments before they had been cargo awaiting transport to certain death. Now they were free women in a world that didn't recognize their freedom, powerful beings in a society that denied sun broke their humanity. The morning through the clouds for day, casting the first time that their shadows long across wooden planks still wet with harbour spray and the memory of judgment. What happened next would depend entirely on choices they had never been allowed to make before. But for the first time since the ships had brought them to this strange land, those choices belonged entirely to them. The silence that followed was more profound than the chaos that had preceded it. Charleston Harbour stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting a sky that seemed cleaner somehow, as if the air itself had been washed by justice. The sisters stood motionless, feeling the weight of chains that were no longer there, breathing air that tasted of salt and freedom and something else, something that had been absent from their lives for so long they had almost forgotten its flavour. Hope. But freedom in 1741 South Carolina was not a gift that lasted long for women who looked like them. Already shouts echoed from the town square behind them, voices raised in alarm, boots pounding on cobblestones, the sound of men organizing themselves for a hunt. The disappearance of 7 prominent white men would not go unnoticed, and suspicion would fall first and hardest on those who had the most reason to celebrate their absence. Kessie turned to her sisters, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to hold the wisdom of rivers. "We cannot stay," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never truly been enslaved, only temporarily displaced. "The water has given us this moment, but the land still belongs to those who would see us hang for what they witnessed here." Amara nodded, her warrior instincts already assessing escape routes and calculating distances. Her scars ached with the memory of what white justice looked like when applied to black skin, and she had no intention of allowing her sisters to experience that particular form of brutality. "The swamps," she said. "We follow the rivers inland, away from their roads and their dogs. The land remembers us better than their laws do." Zuri's gift of sight was already reaching forward, reading the currents of possibility that flowed from this moment like tributaries from a great river. She saw paths through Spanish moss and cypress roots, safe houses run by people whose skin carried the memory of similar journeys, and something else. Something that made her smile for the first time in months. "Others," she whispered. "Others who have been waiting for a sign that resistance is possible." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the baying of bloodhounds and the harsh voices of men who had never questioned their right to own human souls. The sisters moved as one, their bare feet silent on wooden planks, still damp with harbour spray, heading not toward the town, but toward the marshy ground where civilization gave way to wilderness and the old ways still held power. Behind them, the first of the searchers reached the wharf. Sheriff Daniel Cromwell arrived with 12 armed men, their faces grim with the knowledge that 7 of Charleston's most prominent citizens had simply vanished into water that showed no signs of violence or struggle. The wooden planks were wet, but that could be explained by the morning tide. The scattered money and legal documents could have been dropped in panic or confusion. But the complete absence of bodies, of blood, of any trace of the men who had been conducting business here just minutes before, defied every natural law they understood. One of the deputies knelt beside the water's edge, peering into depths that seemed darker than they should be in the morning light. "Sheriff," he called, his voice tight with unease. "Water's deeper here than it ought to be. Can't see the bottom, and I know this harbour like my own backyard." Cromwell ignored the observation, his eyes scanning the crowd of dock workers and sailors who had witnessed the morning's events. His gaze fixed on an elderly black man who'd been loading cargo nearby, a freedman named Josiah whose papers were always in order, but whose eyes held too much knowledge. "You!" he barked. "What did you see here?" Josiah looked up slowly, his weathered face a mask of careful neutrality. "Saw some folks conducting business, Sheriff. Then they wasn't there no more. The water, it got rough for a spell, then went calm again." He shrugged, the gesture encompassing decades of experience in giving white men exactly as much information as they demanded, and no more. "Where are the women?" Cromwell pressed, his hand resting on his pistol grip. 3 African wenches were being sold here this morning. Captain Whitmore's property. Where did they go? Josiah's eyes shifted toward the marsh, but only for a moment. "Last I saw, they was heading toward town, Sheriff. Might be they went looking for their new master, seeing as how the captain done disappeared on them. It was a lie, and everyone present knew it. But it was the kind of lie that allowed white men to maintain their illusions about the natural order of things. Slaves didn't simply walk away from their chains. They certainly didn't possess the power to make their masters vanish into thin air. There had to be a rational explanation, a sequence of events that fit within the boundaries of what civilized men could accept. But as the search continued, rationality became increasingly difficult to maintain. The missing men had left no trace beyond scattered possessions and the lingering scent of fear that seemed to rise from the water itself. Witnesses described impossible things, waves that rose without wind, water that moved against its natural current, voices singing in languages that predated any Christian hymn. Dr. Elias Morrison, Charleston's most respected physician, was summoned to examine the scene for signs of violence or poisoning. He found nothing that his medical training could explain, but he left the wharf walking faster than his usual measured pace, glancing back over his shoulder as if expecting the harbour itself to reach up and claim him next. By noon, word had spread throughout Charleston like fever through a crowded ship. 7 men had vanished without explanation, and the 3 African women who had been present at their disappearance were nowhere to be found. Patrols were organised, rewards posted, bloodhounds brought in to track scents that seemed to vanish at the water's edge, as if the fugitives had simply dissolved into mist. Meanwhile, the sisters moved through landscape that welcomed them like children, returning home. The marshes that surrounded Charleston were ancient places, older than any human settlement, where Spanish moss hung like curtains between worlds, and the distinction between land and water blurred into something more primal. Here, among cypress roots that reached into earth, made sacred by the bones of ancestors, they could breathe without fear for the first time since their capture. Kessie knelt beside a slow-moving creek, cupping water in her palms and drinking deeply. The liquid tasted of iron and memory, carrying echoes of rivers she had known in her homeland. She whispered prayers in her mother's tongue, thanking the spirits that had answered her call for justice, asking for guidance on the path ahead. Amara scouted their backtrail, her warrior's instincts alert for signs of pursuit. But the dogs that had been brought to track them seemed reluctant to follow their scent into the deeper marsh, whining and pulling back towards safer ground when their handlers tried to force them forward. It was as if the very air around the sisters carried warnings that even animals could understand. Zuri sat in meditation, her gift of sight reaching forward through time and space to read the currents of possibility that flowed from this moment. She saw safe houses hidden deep in swampland, communities of escaped slaves who had built new lives beyond the reach of white law. She saw underground railroad conductors who would recognize the power in their eyes and offer passage north to lands where freedom might be more than just a word. And she saw something else, something that made her heart race with excitement and terror in equal measure. She saw others like them, women who remembered what they had been before the chains, who carried power in their blood that no master could own or break. They were scattered across the colonies like seeds, waiting for the right season to bloom, and what had happened in Charleston Harbor that morning would reach them like ripples spreading across still water. In Virginia tobacco fields, a woman named Asher would hear the story and remember that she too had once commanded storms. In Georgia, rice plantations, twins named Foleg and Kahinda, would recognize the sound of their ancestors' voices in the wind. In North Carolina pine forests, an old woman called Grandmother Enkem would smile and begin preparing medicines for the wounded who would soon seek her healing. The drowning of 7 white men in Charleston Harbor was not just an act of revenge, it was a declaration, a signal fire lit in the darkness of bondage to let others know that resistance was possible. That power existed in places their oppressors could not reach or understand, that the chains they wore were not the final word in their stories. As evening approached, painting the marsh in shades of gold and crimson, the sisters made camp on a small island of solid ground, surrounded by water that would hide their tracks and muffle any sounds of approach. They had found wild berries and edible roots, food that their bodies remembered, even if their minds had been trained to forget. For the first time in years, they would sleep without locks on their doors, or overseers counting their breaths. Kessie built a small fire, shielding the flames with her body so the light wouldn't carry far. Around the flickering glow, the sisters sat in a circle that felt both ancient and newly born, their faces lit by fire that danced like the spirits of their ancestors. They spoke in low voices, sharing memories of home, of family, of the lives they had lived before the ships came to steal their futures. But they also spoke of what lay ahead, of the network of safe houses and secret routes that could carry them north to freedom, of the communities they might build with others who understood the weight of chains and the sweetness of breaking them, of the children they might bear who would never know the taste of bondage, who would grow up free to command water and wind and fire without fear. The sound of drums echoed across the marsh, faint but unmistakable. Not the drums of pursuit or alarm, but the rhythmic heartbeat of communication between those who knew the old ways. Messages passed from settlement to settlement, coded in beats that carried news faster than any horse or ship. The sisters smiled, recognizing the patterns their grandmothers had taught them, understanding that their story was already traveling ahead of them like morning light chasing away darkness. In the distance, Charleston Harbor reflected moonlight like scattered silver, peaceful now but forever changed by what had occurred in its depths. The authorities would continue their search, offering increasingly desperate explanations for the disappearance of 7 prominent men. Pirates, they would claim. Foreign agents. Acts of God that no mortal could predict or prevent. But in the quarters and in the hidden places where the enslaved gathered to remember who they truly were, a different story would be told. The story of 3 sisters who turned drowning into justice, who proved that water remembers everything and eventually claims what it is owed. The story of women who refused to be cargo and became legends instead. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Zuri's gift of sight reached forward one more time, reading the threads of fate that stretched from this moment into the future. She saw their stories spreading like ripples across water, inspiring others to remember their own power, to resist in ways both small and spectacular. She saw the fear that would creep into the hearts of slaveholders when they looked at their human property, and wondered what thoughts moved behind carefully lowered eyes. Most of all, she saw the children yet unborn, who would grow up knowing that their ancestors had not submitted quietly to bondage, that resistance lived in their blood like an inheritance waiting to be claimed. They would carry different names and speak different languages, but they would remember the lesson of the Ashford sisters, that even in the deepest darkness, even when all hope seemed lost, the current of rebellion runs deeper than any ocean. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up towards stars that had watched this land long before white men claimed it, long before ships brought chains and sorrow across the Atlantic. In that firelight, 3 women who had been enslaved property that morning sat free under an endless sky, planning their next moves in a game where the rules had suddenly changed in their favor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new choices between survival and surrender. But tonight, for the first time in years, they slept as free women, lulled by the sound of water that remembered their names and whispered promises of justice yet to come. The morning brought with it the sound of bloodhounds and the thunder of hooves across wooden bridges. Sheriff Cromwell had spent the night assembling the largest manhunt Charleston had ever seen. 50 armed men, 20 dogs, and a fury that burned hotter than summer sun. The disappearance of 7 prominent citizens could not be explained away as accident or coincidence. Someone had to pay, someone always did. But the sisters were already gone, melted into the swampland like morning mist, following waterways that existed on no white man's map. Cassie led them deeper into the marsh, her feet finding paths that seemed to appear beneath her steps. The water spoke to her in whispers, telling her which channels ran deep enough to hide their passage, which islands offered solid ground for rest. Behind them, the search parties crashed through undergrowth like blind giants, their dogs whining and circling in confusion. The scent they followed seemed to split and multiply, leading trackers in circles until even the most experienced hunters began to mutter about witchcraft and unnatural workings. Some of the dogs refused to continue altogether, sitting stubbornly at the water's edge and howling as if they sensed something their masters could not. By midday, word had reached every plantation within 50 miles. 3 African women, dangerous and possibly possessed of dark powers, were loose in the countryside. Rewards were posted. Patrols doubled. Every black face was scrutinized with suspicion that bordered on hysteria. The comfortable certainty of white supremacy had been shaken, and fear filled the cracks like poison seeping into wounds. At Riverside Manor, Captain Whitmore's wife Martha sat in her parlour, staring at an empty chair where her husband should have been reading his morning paper. She clutched a handkerchief soaked with tears that wouldn't stop coming, not from grief, but from terror. She had seen those 3 women work in her kitchen, had watched them serve at her table with eyes that never met hers directly. Now she understood that their downcast gaze had not been submission, but calculation. The other plantation wives gathered around her like crows around carrion, their voices sharp with speculation and dread. They spoke in hushed tones about servants who might be watching, listening, planning. Every black hand that poured their tea, every face that cleaned their chambers, suddenly seemed capable of unimaginable violence. The very people they had trusted to raise their children and prepare their food now looked like potential assassins. But in the quarters, a different conversation was taking place. Old Moses, who had survived 40 years of bondage and 3 different masters, sat on a stump outside his cabin, whittling a piece of cypress with hands that shook not from age, but from excitement. Children gathered around his feet like moths drawn to flame, their eyes wide with hunger for the story he was telling. He spoke of 3 sisters who had commanded the very waters to rise up and swallow their oppressors, how they had stood at the edge of the wharf and sung in voices that reached back to Africa itself, calling on ancestors who had never forgotten the taste of freedom. How the harbour had answered their call with waves that defied nature and justice that flowed like tide returning to claim its own. The children listened with the intensity of prayer, memorizing every word, every gesture. They would carry this story in their bones, pass it down to their own children and grandchildren until it became more than history. It would become prophecy, promise, proof that the chains binding them were not eternal, that somewhere in their blood ran the power to break free. Miles away, deep in the Congaree swamp, the sisters had found refuge with a community that existed in the spaces between worlds. Maroons, they called themselves. Escapees who had built new lives in places too wild for white law to follow. Their village was hidden on an island that could only be reached by those who knew which channels to follow, protected by water and wisdom and the fierce determination of people who had chosen death over continued bondage. The leader of this community was a woman known only as Grandmother Oya, though she looked no older than 40 summers. Her skin bore the ritual scars of nobility from across the ocean, and her eyes held depths that reminded the sisters of home. She welcomed them not as refugees, but as returning daughters, embracing each one with arms that felt like safety itself. Around a fire built from sacred wood, the sisters told their story to an audience that understood every word, every silence, every breath between the telling. These were people who had made their own impossible escapes, who had turned their backs on the only world white men allowed them to know, and created something entirely new in the wilderness. They listened without judgment, without surprise, as if women commanding water to drown their oppressors was as natural as rain falling from clouds. When the telling was finished, Grandmother Oya spoke in a voice that carried the authority of rivers. "You have done what needed doing," she said. "But this is only the beginning. The water has tasted their blood now, and will not forget the flavor. Others will follow your example. Others will remember what we truly are beneath the lies they tell about us." She gestured toward the fire where shadows danced like spirits made visible. Already word spreads through the hidden places. In Virginia, a woman named Asher stirs her cooking pot and thinks of drowning. In Georgia, twins whisper to each other in the language of storms. In North Carolina, an old healer grinds herbs that could stop a heart or heal a wound, depending on her intention. The sisters felt something shift in the air around them, a change in the current of possibility itself. What they had done in Charleston Harbor was not an ending, but a beginning, the first note in a song that would echo across generations. They had proven that resistance was possible, that power existed in places their oppressors could neither reach nor understand. Over the following weeks, reports trickled in from across the colonies. Strange accidents befalling cruel overseers, mysterious illnesses striking particularly vicious masters, ships carrying human cargo encountering storms that seemed to come from nowhere, waves that rose without wind to answer. The authorities tried to dismiss these incidents as coincidence, but those who lived in the quarters knew better. The spirits were stirring, and the sisters had shown them the way. In Charleston, the search for the missing women gradually lost its urgency as other concerns pressed upon the authorities. Pirates were raiding shipping lanes. Spanish forces threatened the southern border. The economy of human bondage demanded constant attention lest it collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. 7 missing men, however prominent, could not hold the colony's focus forever, but the fear remained, settling into the bones of the ruling class like a fever that never quite broke. They hired more guards, imposed stricter curfews, increased patrols along waterways and through swampland. Every unexpected sound in the night, every servant's sideways glance, every moment of silence that stretched too long reminded them that their power was not absolute, that somewhere in the darkness, forces moved that did not recognize their authority. The sisters themselves had become something more than human in the telling and retelling of their story. They were spirits of vengeance, water witches, descendants of African gods who had followed their children across the ocean to exact justice on those who dared claim ownership of sacred souls. Their names were spoken in whispers, invoked in prayers, carved into the secret places where the enslaved gathered to remember who they had been before the chains. But they were also still women, still flesh and blood and bone, still carrying the scars of bondage, even as they walked free through swampland, that welcomed them like daughters returning home. They helped with the daily work of survival in the maroon community, gathering food and medicines, teaching children the old songs, sharing knowledge that had been forbidden in the world they had left behind. Kessie found herself drawn to the water again and again, sitting by the edge of hidden lagoons where she could feel the pulse of currents that connected this place to every river, every ocean, every drop of moisture in the endless cycle of rain and return. She spoke to the spirits that lived in these waters, thanking them for their assistance, asking for guidance on the path ahead. Amara trained with other warriors in the community, men and women who had turned their backs on submission and chosen to fight for the right to exist on their own terms. She taught them techniques learned in her homeland, ways of moving through hostile territory without leaving tracks, methods of striking quickly and disappearing before retaliation could follow. Her scars were badges of honor here, proof of battles fought and survived. Zuri spent her days with the community's healers and wise women, learning new ways to read the currents of fate and possibility. Her gift of sight grew stronger in this place, where such talents were valued rather than feared, where visions were treated as prophecy rather than madness. She began to see further into the future, watching the ripples of their actions spread across time like stones thrown into still water. The sisters had turned water into weapon, drowning into justice, chains into freedom. But their story was never just about 3 women or 7 drowned men. It was about the current that runs beneath every act of oppression, waiting for the right moment to rise. Kessie, Amara, and Zuri proved that even in the darkest depths of bondage, resistance flows like an underground river, carrying the memory of ancestors and the promise of liberation. Their names became more than legend. They became proof that no chain can hold what the water remembers, and the water remembers everything.